Allow me to share with you a few moments about my Canandaigua, New York home, engaged in a most pleasurable and meaningful activity that is consistent with the joys of my retirement years. The meditative act of working with my hands happens beautifully well when processing apples for winter storage. I shall demonstrate my system of peeling, coring, and slicing apples and the use of wood stove heat to dry them. Before the days of refrigeration, dried apples served wonderfully well as a food product that would provide quality nutrition, keep well, and that need only be protected from rodents. I welcome the coming of fall to my idyllic surroundings at Barnum Wood. As the first frosts bring an end to puttering in my flower gardens, I'm able to sit back to contemplate the results of many a past project. The stone retaining wall, which served as an outstanding weight training program and behind which now exist another 1,000 daffodil bulbs, pleases me particularly well. The rekindling of my passion for daffodils must now await the coming of spring. My recently completed wood house contains nearly 25 face cords of processed fuel wood, which will be sufficient to provide nearly 2 full seasons of heat for my cozy home. I find particular satisfaction in sustainable management of my forests for fuel wood and saw logs. My very much studied and active program to maximize the diversity of habitat pays wonderful dividends by increasing the number and variety of creatures that creep, leap, feed, swim, or fly, or otherwise enrich my own existence. I am particularly fond of my frogs. I drift. Let us get back to the subject at hand. I am delighted and very fortunate to have a good friend who is surrounded by commercial apple orchards. The grower allows us to take the windfalls, which otherwise will recycle into the earth, into the earthworms. These are in really pretty fine form and allow for the process of drying and preserving. I do allow myself to get distracted as I look out of my kitchen window about ready to process these apples. I am surrounded by forest and take abundant opportunity to observe many of the creatures wandering freely. The apple drying process begins with a peeling coring operation. This particular item, which is available today, it looks kind of like an antique, but it works with incredible ease, provided the apples are small and firm. The edges have to be sharp and maintained, but turning the crank peels the strip right off, slices the apple into a spiral of thin wafers, placing the apple on the prongs and allowing the core to line up with the coring device, a hollow tube at the end of that. It's now being forced onto that sharp round edge. Throw the peels away. Core is free. Reject that. Problem arises when the apples are a little larger and not as firm as they might be. As we'll see, this creates an issue with the ability of those prongs to hold and allow that to be sliced cleanly through. It is broken loose. The apple is pretty much destroyed in terms of this nice concentric spiral of rings. All is not lost. We'll see how to salvage these. But in order to keep the process going and deal with these large apples that don't work on the mechanical corer peeler, I've devised a process which involves a copper pipe but sharpened. This is post 77. There's not lead in the solder edges of that. Drive it through the apple, punch the core out, line it up so that it goes through the center of the apple, which is not necessarily the mathematical center. Punch out the seeds in the core and proceed, again, a meditative, active, productive kind of an activity. I find it a joy. The apples which have been cored do need to be peeled. A hand peeler and developed technique. It's possible to completely core, peel, and slice one apple in less than 30 seconds. It's not a race, but it doesn't take that much time. And as with any sequential piecework, as you keep going, progress adds up dramatically. I did try using the peels, dried them and ground them up, but I couldn't find any way to use them that was appropriate to my mind. They certainly turn a rich brown, rusty color, and they didn't have a very good texture or, for that matter, taste. But once the apples are peeled, those that have simply been cored, we slice. The thickness of the slice can vary. There are certain benefits to thin ones or thick ones. I'll describe this a little bit later. Good sharp knife is a joy. A little careful of your fingers here. But the process that I've evolved utilizes 2 apples at a time, sliced in this manner. Once they're severed, they obtain what is a barbecue skewer, and thread the apples onto this and put them over, ready to be hoisted into the plume of heat rising from my wood stove. The apples which have been cored, peeled, and sliced by the mechanical machine need to be sliced in such a manner that the separate rings come apart. If you cut the heavy end of this, there is always some eccentricity in the apple. When the slices are separated, the apples won't spin off and fall onto the stove. They've been sliced. I approached the wood stove, which is cranked and heating in the fall of the year. We don't need a fire all the time, but this stove is enough to keep the chill off the house. I fabricated, well, before that, we got to feed the stove, keep it up to speed. I've got a good supply of fuel wood. Most of it's been dried at least a year, which is a very desirable circumstance if you can manage to do it. There's that piece of oak fabricated, assembled in such a way that it supports the barbecue skewers over the heat of the stove. 2 apples on the skewer, and separate them. It's a little bit of handwork. The point of a knife and little twist and little pull. Put it just enough to get some airspace to come in between them. That piece that fell off, actually the stove isn't as hot as it might be. That would smoke. The apples that have been mechanically cored and peeled and sliced with that little machine do tend to fall apart more readily than those that have a complete ring that I've created by coring and peeling and then slicing. Move those out of the way. Bring up another pair of apples on a skewer. This particular batch of apples was cored and sliced only. Separate those, move them across. Now, from another angle, you see what's happening over the stove. Here, a pair of apples that do have a slice in them. These are that came off the core peeler unit. Do tend to fall apart and fall onto the stove more readily. I put a screen down there, a little pie crust cooling screen, to catch the apples if they fall, prevent them from smoking and burning. And ultimately I use that screen to dry the pieces that didn't quite stay on the skewer routine. They do have to be separated. If they stick together, they don't begin to dry properly and then do stick. But there are 12 spaces in this position so that you get 24 apples to start out with. Now here are the apples that are simply cored and sliced. It's possible to dry a quarter of an apple at a time and trim off the small end and leave really thick pieces. These dry down a little more slowly and are actually quite a meal unto themselves. You've got to get pretty serious about chewing the big, thick, leathery quarter chunks of apples, but they have an absolutely marvelous flavor, the dried apples do. I find it difficult not to overeat on these things as I'm going through this process. The screen on the somewhat cooler portion of the stove works out, it turns out quite handily to dry those pieces of apple that resulted from the large one falling apart with the mechanical crank device. A couple of 3 apples on the screens, and to keep them from getting too hot, they dry out as nicely as the apples suspended over the top of the stove. Give them about a day, and they dry out to the point where they lose moisture and will not mold. The apples begin to shrink and curl a bit, and within a fairly short period of time, it's possible to consolidate apples from one skewer onto another, to take a skewer off. These compress, they're curled up, and they're still going to continue to dry like this. And take another skewer. They're not quite ready, they're not dry enough to remove from the heat, but string the 4 apples now on that barbecue skewer, and then reinsert it. You can make space for 2 more fresh juicy ones. I repeat this process, and instead of 24 apples on the 12 skewers, you can get 48. Actually, those in the middle dry quite a bit faster, and they're ready to remove sooner than those that are on either end of that central portion of the stove where the hot air rises most handily. We have now 2 open spaces to put more skewers. Some aren't quite dry enough yet to consolidate. Whoops, a little nibble there. We have a number of skewers in the center with 2 apples each, brand new ones on the outer edges with there are 4 apples in the center there, 2 on the outsides. When they get to the point where they're almost dry enough, you can tell by the weight of the skewer, pick it up and have to take those that are apparently ready. And then the process of take them apart and get them separated so they don't stick and jam together. Those aren't quite dry enough to come off. Take them apart, and in this process separate them so that they don't stick together ultimately when they're packaged. And find oops, there's a couple that are too wet. Put those back on the skewer and dry them for a little bit longer. That entire skewer apparently is adequately dry. Continue this process. Heap up the dried apples on the table. A whole nother batch came in. My good friend said, I'll bring you some more apples in return for dried ones. Ultimately, I suspect that we're looking at nearly, probably 40-50 pounds of apples dried there that weigh very little. Apples all dried and ready to pack. There are different ways to do this, and I've found that a quart baggie is just about right. It's a nice amount of apples, probably 8 to 10 apples, and dried apples can fit in a little quart baggie when they're dry like this. The concentration of sugar in those rings is sufficient to inhibit the bacteria and mold growth. They preserve and keep very nicely. They actually will absorb moisture from the atmosphere if allowed to. You can dry them to the point where they're crunchy, crispy, but give them some time, they'll soak up enough atmospheric moisture to soften down. You want to get enough in the bag to make efficient use of the space. And get that. New bags form a really nice seal, and they're actually can create a vacuum inside the bag slightly by squeezing all of the air out, sealing it, and then letting it go. The apples kind of expand the bag and hold it closed. I found that get them packed in the bag, and it helps to put some weight on them and crush them down so that make more efficient use of the space and seal the bag up. The end product, a year's supply of delightfully tasty and healthy snacks for myself, as well as a good supply of most often welcome gift bags for friends and family, satisfies deeply. Gazing out the east window of my Barnum Wood home causes me to shift mental gears from apple drying to the next in sequence of fall activities, catching a venison. Both of these guys came out of the forest along the path immediately beneath my tree stand to engage in their own playful ritual. The transition from fall to winter often happens with surprising suddenness. I must admit that I cherish the parade of seasons. Each has its own particular appeal. Always I have welcomed the moments of quiet peace enveloped by the gentle warmth emanating from my wood-fired appliances.